Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Tempe, Arizona, I'm Nick Zoutra. That's right, it's halfway through winter break, and my wife and I are back at home visiting some family from my hometown of Tempe, Arizona. Mentioned in the last episode, I've been enjoying the winter months back in Bloomington, but I must say I'm enjoying this weather in Tempe of 75 to 80 degrees a little bit more. Hanging out outside in the sunshine, seeing some old friends, wearing shorts in December. You really can't beat this weather, especially the December and winter weather in Arizona. It's fantastic. So it's already got me thinking about the summer, to be honest, and what that's going to be like. I'm particularly excited for the summer for a couple of other reasons. One, I just found out that I received some supplementary summer funding from the cognitive science program at Indiana University that will help me to attend the CogSci conference in London this summer and hopefully present a paper there. So that will be pretty exciting. The other thing that I'm really excited about is that a fellow cognitive science graduate student, Anastasia Nicolina, and I recently applied as an interdisciplinary team to the Summer Seminars in Neuroscience and Philosophy 2-week summer workshop. It's been going on for 3 years, and it's sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation, and it's at Duke University. The motivation for this summer workshop, as I've come to learn about, is the idea that philosophers in neurosciences do study many of the same big questions about, for example, free will, morality, human nature, perception, knowledge, consciousness. Yet sadly, researchers in these disciplines rarely work together or even understand each other when they attempt to. So to advance these fields by fostering mutual appreciation and collaboration, Duke University, along with the John Templeton Foundation, conducts an annual summer seminar series of around 15 days where they invite 10 fellows from neuroscience and 10 from contemporary philosophy to learn about recent developments in neuroscience, as well as theories and methods in philosophy. Fellows, they form interdisciplinary teams either before or after they participate, and they design experiments that focus on these big questions that both interest neuroscientists and philosophers. And then the most promising of these experiments are actually funded and then carried out with guidance from some of the project staff and then reported at the next year's seminar. And what's really cool is that at the end of the 2-week seminar, there's like a 2-day closing conference that's open to the public that involves leading figures from both disciplines and presentation of some of their recent research. So this was a seminar. The application was due December 18th. So Anastasia and I worked very diligently while also working on grading and finals and whatnot to submit our project and research proposal. I think we, working together and coming to think about this, it was a very great team effort, and it really exemplified, what I think doing good research in philosophy of science, as well as doing good scientific research involves, which involves, a mutual appreciation for working scientists and philosophers who are working at the intersection of different fields. And it really helped that when we came together to work, I myself had particular questions about our research proposal, which happened to be on the sense of agency in addictive disorders, and Anastasia's particular interest related to employing functional connectivity measures to investigate these different conceptions of a sense of agency in this particular population. So I will certainly update you guys on the status of this application. And, if it works out, fantastic. And if it does not, which I've heard it's pretty competitive, that's okay. I've really found that just in general, it was an extremely rewarding exercise to come together with a fellow colleague from a different discipline and write up a research proposal. It's definitely going to be a model in which I use going forward in conducting my own research. And it turns out that the guest on today's show, Mr. David Danks from Carnegie Mellon University, philosopher of science, was a recent speaker at a previous seminar series there at Duke. I did not know this at the time, but of the interview, but it was just really fun to learn. So let me briefly introduce David here. David's research largely falls at the intersection of philosophy of cognitive science and machine learning, using ideas and frameworks from each to inform the others. His primary research in recent years has been in computational cognitive science, developing fully specified computational models to describe, predict, and most importantly, explain human behavior. He's focused in particular on the representations and processes that underlie complex human cognition, including causal learning, inference, concept acquisition, application, and decision making. And this cognitive architecture resulting from this research is actually laid out in one of his recent books called Unifying the Mind, Cognitive Representations and Graphical Models. And most recently, David's begun to explore how this high-level cognitive architecture could actually be implemented or instantiated in psychologically plausible lower-level models. David has a fascinating story, and I really appreciate his approach. It's something that I think really aligns well with the core mission of this podcast, and I think with philosophers of science in general who are interested in engaging with scientists in interesting ways. You'll come to learn through this interview that I think David's approach is really about focusing on the problems for research and really doing whatever it takes, working with whoever can essentially like contribute to these problems in a highly effective, integrated, and interdisciplinary way. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear about David's story, David's interests, and hopefully you will learn something for yourselves if you're interested in doing this kind of research or tweaking the way in which you do research in the future. So, okay, let's bring David in. So yeah, let's start back at the beginning. Where did you grow up, David?
Where did I grow? So I grew up in Kent, Ohio, home of Kent State University, it's this rather typical college town in the sense of being in Northeast Ohio, and there's sort of the university there, and most people are either directly or indirectly connected to the universities. So,
yeah, did you have some early connections growing up there? Parents?
I did. My father was a professor there, and in psychology, of all things, he's a psycholinguist.
Oh, wow!
Studying issues having to do with translation and bilinguals and how they think about the world, and a mother who was a high school English teacher.
So very immersed in education.
It was, and I think in some ways, in the long run, looking back, I think it made a difference because it never occurred to me that I could not be a professor. There's too many double negative there, but I think you understand what I'm saying, that the idea of going on to a life in education was sort of there from the very, very beginning. There was no question that this was the sort of thing that somebody could do.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a small world. My own father was a clinical psychologist at where I grew up from Arizona State. So I can relate with that similarity of growing up with the professor, maybe expectation or just that is the career path with which is there for you.
It is. And I don't think I understood that at all in a certain sense when I was a kid. I've since gone back to my father and said, now I understand what you were doing every night after dinner. Because I just didn't get it as a kid. As a kid, I was doing kid things, growing up half a mile from a lake. And so, every summer was spent swimming and doing those kinds of things and just trying to enjoy being a Midwestern kid. In that sense, it was, I suppose, a very ordinary upbringing in many ways. The exception was having the opportunities to do a lot of traveling. It's one of the real benefits of being an academic is you get to do a lot of traveling. And my father did a lot of international research, and so did have the opportunity to do a lot of travel as a kid, even though it was a sort of in that sense standard middle class upbringing otherwise. Yeah.
So as a kid playing in the Midwestern lakes, what was your perception of the academic life?
Wow. I don't think I had one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's as crazy as that is. I mean, there was my father and his friends, and they went to work. Adults. I mean,
that's a nice way.
I really don't think it occurred to me what they did every day or what it would be like to be an academic. It was demystified in the sense that I understood that they were just ordinary people in a lot of ways, if a little bit eccentric. But I don't think I really had an understanding of what research was, for example. I had the opportunity when I was in high school to take some classes at Kent State. And so I would take these college classes, but when you're only taking one class, if you just show up for it a couple of days a week, it's not the sort of thing even where you understand what it's like to be in an intellectual environment, like a modern university is, where everybody around you is engaged, well, hopefully is engaged
for the most part,
and really focused on the life of the mind and the life of knowledge creation, as it were.
Okay, so having some opportunities early on. What were some of the things early on in elementary, middle, high school that, if anything, was there anything that was pulling you toward the sciences other than having a father and mother immersed in education?
Well, that was what pulled me to the sciences. Is I just loved science. I was a geek. Past tense, perhaps. I loved math. Really just loved math, loved logic puzzles, loved anything having to do with the sciences, especially sciences like physics and chemistry, where there were actual rules. I'm sure a psychoanalyst could have a field day with this. And computers. So I, have early memories of, the first memories I have of computer coding are in elementary school, coding on something that was called a VIC-20.
Okay.
So named because it had 20 kilobytes of memory.
Wow.
And I'm that old. Or in the days when you would write computer programs and you would store them out on literal cassette tapes. And so you'd have to press play or record on a cassette recorder that was plugged into an old Commodore computer, for example.
Wow.
And that's sort of what really fascinated me, I think, when I look back on it, was the ways in which very simple systems could lead to very complex worlds. That the complexity of the world was not complexity all the way down. There were ways to bring order to the world, and I think that was something that, for a kid, can be very powerful because it can help you to realize that it's not just randomness. Now, that doesn't mean that I could control my world in all the ways I wanted to, of course.
Sure, but did it give you a sense of security knowing that, or do you remember feeling any particular emotions toward this kind of sense of order? I
do. It wasn't security, though. It was fascination.
Oh, sure.
Sort of this just amazement that so much could come from these systems that were, at the end of the day, reasonably well behaved. I can imagine somebody listening to this thinking, wow, you must have had this really bizarre home life, and that you were seeking order or something like that, which wasn't true at all. My parents were high school sweethearts. They're married to this day. I have an older brother who has, done well in his career. So had this, incredibly stable nuclear family. So it wasn't as though I was dealing with troubles and seeking solace somewhere. It was just a kind of, I suppose, sense of fascination and wonderment.
I feel it's like the human condition of being curious about things.
It is. I think I was lucky enough to, in that sense, I was lucky enough to have a very stable home life that enabled me to just be curious and just think, wow, this is cool. And it helped that I was able to be pretty good at it. And in contrast with things like writing, which I found incredibly difficult. And so that of course increases the allure of something when you're pretty good at it.
Yeah. In terms of writing, which is something I'm sure you do quite often now. What was challenging about it early on?
I think what was challenging was that I didn't understand, and this will sound perhaps somewhat strange coming from a philosopher, but I didn't understand the importance of getting the words right.
Okay.
I would have clear ideas in some sense in my head, and I had no idea how to translate that into clear words, or even how important it was to translate them into clear words. And to the extent that I knew I should and I was having trouble with it, I found that frustrating in a way that if you're doing math and science, it's very easy oftentimes to figure out what words or notation, as it were, to use. And so I think that, it wasn't something that came easily. It still is not something that comes easily to me. And but getting things so that I felt like what was in my head actually translated onto the page, I just found that very difficult and still do.
Yeah, I don't know if it ever becomes so easily. I imagine for some it does. But it is still an exercise in translation where you're moving all the things going on in your head out in some sort of straightforward way that, can certainly be challenging.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, there's an interesting sort of impact of the precision one can have in math and science, that when you get used to having that, I think it gets even more frustrating when you start to work with words, which are, of course, I now recognize that math and science, it's a facade of precision. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that is not precise at all. Mm-hmm. But when you're 10, 12, 14 years old, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah. Do you remember some of your, how did you think about science as a thing, as an enterprise back then? Do you recall?
Well, I thought about it as a way to find out about the world. I think I was a lot more excited by math than I was in some ways by science. I mean, I've better, at the very least, I have better memories of thinking about math.
Okay, so math,
And what I remember thinking about it is just the sense of exploration and discovery, working through these systems, these sort of structures of mathematical objects and discovering things about them. Now, of course, these are, at that point I was doing mathematics. You're proving things that were proven 300 years earlier. It wasn't true discovery in the sense that nobody knew, but it was a feeling of discovery for me that, oh, wait a second, you give me the raw materials and I can figure out something new.
Yeah. So you carried on. Did this lead to further study in math growing up through high school? Was that something you were interested in?
It was. So, high school, I pretty quickly maxed out the math classes I could do, and those were the courses I was taking at Kent State.
Yeah, I was curious because I recall in high school, it seemed to those who were further advanced in math, it only went up to calculus 1 or 2, and even in some ways it was even better to go over to the community college or the local university to take those classes.
It was. So by my senior year, I was taking math classes at Kent State after taking all the class in my high school and then doing independent studies to go further because I didn't have a driver's license yet, so I couldn't get to that school. So I had to just find a way to make it work. So that was very much what I was doing.
Did you do tutoring at all in high school? Was that something of interest? Or
I didn't. I mean, either being a tutor or a tutee, I did not do those things. So part of it was I didn't feel like I had much of a community.
Oh, yeah.
In a certain sense, when you're doing something that is more advanced than your classmates around you,
kind of like your own island out there.
It was. And I suppose my reaction was very much one of, I'm going to just do my thing and not worry about the fact that I'm taking math classes that are pretty far beyond what most of my classmates would ever consider taking.
Sure.
And so that was, but it was okay. I mean, nobody got in my way. It was just a matter of, all right, if you want to do this, you can, but you have to be the one to do it.
Okay.
Which I suppose, this is interesting. I haven't thought about some of these things in quite a while, but it does make me now think about some of the things that we'll probably get to about, for example, graduate school experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So growing up, how was the experience growing up, high school, et cetera, in Ohio?
Right. Well, I only jokingly say it was a wonderful place to grow up, and I'm glad I don't live there anymore.
Sure.
It was a quiet town. There wasn't a whole lot to do, but you had Cleveland and Akron, which I don't think people perhaps think of as great places to go, but I was very involved in music. And so having the Cleveland Orchestra, which is sort of really a world-class institution.
Oh, did you play? Did you play?
I was a string bass.
Oh, great.
So I was very involved with that. And, so I was driving up every week to rehearsals for the Cleveland Youth Orchestra and having a lot of opportunities there. And so in that sense, it was a very good experience. I wasn't an athlete, so I was not a part of that culture. I wanted to be an athlete, but he quickly figured out that wasn't the thing for me, at least at that time.
Did you have a sport or anything you tried out for or were particularly interested in?
Well, in true Midwestern fashion, I played football up in my freshman year. And then I discovered that I really didn't like trying to hurt people. And it seemed to me there had to be a certain amount of that in one's character, or at least at that moment. And so I thought, I don't want to do this. And so instead started doing drama, of all things. And so did, drama and musicals and played string bass and had...
Into the arts and theater and choir crowd. Yeah,
it was. And it was, it was a very... In certain senses, there's no skeletons or anything. It was a very safe, good, secure time. I, didn't have big traumas. It was in retrospect, I realized just how very lucky I was. But it was a good time growing up. And by the time I was finishing high school, I was really ready to leave. I felt like I'd gotten what I could out of that place, and I wanted to sort of be in a very different environment, and in particular to be in a very different kind of intellectual environment.
Yeah, so I can plainly understand growing up in a college town. And you applied to different colleges. Where did you end up for undergrad?
So I went to Princeton for undergrad.
Oh, great! Well,
and went there with the full intention of doing something at the intersection of math and physics. Did 2 years of, the very intense mathematics, the math major version of the math classes. So it was 10 of us at most were the people in these classes, learning a tremendous amount. And it was great. And then I realized that I really, really didn't want to do math for the rest of my life.
So how did you come to that conclusion?
I realized I didn't enjoy it. I enjoyed learning about it, and I enjoyed thinking about it, and I didn't necessarily enjoy doing it. Now, part of the problem was that there was one class in particular, complex analysis, where suddenly my intuitions didn't work anymore. I was no longer able to figure out what we were doing in a certain sense. I could manipulate the symbols. Thinking in terms of philosophy of mathematics, it was really fascinating because I felt like I made this transition into a kind of formalism where math is just symbol manipulation and there's rules to the game. And I felt like that's what I was doing. I could move the symbols around to prove the theorems that they wanted for homeworks and these sorts of things. But I had no understanding about what I was doing or why these simple manipulations worked. And it made me think, all right, well, it must be that all future math is going to be like this, and I don't enjoy doing symbol manipulation, so maybe this isn't for me. Now, I've since discovered in talking to other people who have spent time either before or after as math majors, that in fact, lots of people feel this way about complex analysis. It turns out it's something very few people have good intuitions about. And so I shouldn't have drawn that inference from what I was going through, but I didn't know that at the time.
Sure.
And
it seems like a reasonable generalization, though, if this is going to be, what else could be challenging. But sure, I suppose it would have been nice to take a poll of everybody else in the course or some other people. How are you guys dealing with this?
Yeah. Who else is completely lost right about now?
Yeah.
But it was particularly, I think, for me, quite frustrating because the concepts and the way that the pieces fit together had always been the part of math that I enjoyed the most. And also the part that came fairly naturally to me. And so when I felt like I'd lost that, it really made me question whether it was the right thing for me. And so I'm there as a second semester sophomore, had always planned to be a math major and suddenly decided I didn't want to. In part because I also had this naive view that what you majored in is what you had to do for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
I don't know why I thought that. I think a lot. I mean, I now look at the undergrads I teach, and they all think that, and I understand that that's natural to think. It's, of course, entirely false.
Sure.
But it was the way I was thinking at the time. And so I sort of looked around, and I thought, well, what have I enjoyed in the last year? And I'd taken 2 classes in the philosophy department at that point. Mm-hmm. And I say it that way because one was a decision theory class, so it wasn't sort of normal philosophy, and the other was philosophy of quantum mechanics.
Oh.
So neither one particularly, a normal philosophy class. But I thought, well, this is fun. I enjoyed that. Maybe I should look at what else there is in philosophy. So I was one of those strange people who actually read the course catalog and discovered that there was this very unusual provision that you could have a concentration in philosophy of science. And if you had a concentration in philosophy of science, you could count science classes towards a philosophy major.
Oh, that's perfect.
So I thought, oh, this is great. And then I looked and saw that they had classes in things like intermediate and advanced logic. And I thought, this is great. I can basically do a math degree for like half math, half philosophy. And I don't have to take those things that don't interest me, like Greek philosophy or ethics.
Sure.
At the time, that was the way I thought, I will admit. And I thought, great, I don't have to do that. So I decided to do this bizarre concentration, in part because I looked at it as it's the way that I can take the classes I want and they'll still give me a degree. Mm-hmm. So it was less about falling in love with philosophy. It was more that I looked and said, where are the things that I think it would be fun to learn about and that I would be really excited to learn about?
Yeah.
In light of what I've already done, which I suppose is entirely, in some ways, the wrong. I mean, it's an incredibly risky strategy. I had no realization that I was doing anything risky by doing this.
Sure. It sounds to me like kind of like a sort of a predecessor of a interdisciplinary studies degree.
Exactly.
Which are really great for the sake of getting to take all the things that you want. But come graduation time, they don't always look as strong in terms of getting into graduate school, having a degree in interdisciplinary studies. It's just not as strong as a undergraduate degree in physics or something like that.
That's absolutely right. It's very easy to fall through the cracks with a degree or with a background as anomalous as mine was. At the time, and I suppose still is. Mm-hmm. And so I looked so I could take philosophy of math. I took logic classes. I did take one history class and a couple of ethics-y kinds of classes, but they were more to satisfy requirements. So my history, actually I took 2 history classes now that I think about it, one in Nietzsche and one on 20th century analytic philosophy. So I somehow...
Did you enjoy any of those, or were those
I did. Classes? I confess I enjoyed Nietzsche.
Oh, cool.
To this day, I actually teach a Nietzsche class now, which is completely bizarre in some ways if you looked at my background. But I enjoyed it. In retrospect, I now realize I enjoyed it in part for the same reason I enjoy math and science, which is it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle to try and take these superficially inconsistent and at times incoherent statements and find an explanation that can make sense of all of them, or as many of them as possible simultaneously.
I think it is a very optimistic appreciation of Nietzsche. I think that's great. No, I think that's wonderful. I wish I could take your class.
Well, come to Pittsburgh.
I'll come. I love to. No, maybe send me the syllabus sometime. I'd love to see. Yeah.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. And but so it does mean that I somehow graduated with a degree in philosophy without ever reading Kant. Mm-hmm. Ever read a word of Kant when I got my degree? I hope nobody at Princeton is hearing this.
That's blasphemy.
Broke my degree.
Sure.
But it was, in that sense, as you said, it was trying to do something a little bit interdisciplinary when I didn't know that that's what I was trying to do. Mm-hmm. And so it was sort of, well, this seems interesting, and I think I might want to know more about it, so I'm going to go do that. Whereas the history of philosophy didn't seem that interesting to me at the time. So I'm not going to take my time to do that.
That's fair.
Well, it's fair, but it leads to very strange gaps in the sense that I think that there are things that people expect that somebody will know with the kind of background that I've got. If you just look at the degrees, every degree I have is in philosophy.
It is true. Yeah. In terms of philosophy, there does seem to be this expectation of having being well read with particular works.
Yes, absolutely.
Unlike, I suppose, I'm trying to think in relation to other fields, but in the humanities, I think that's the case. But in things like psychology, I was a psych major. You had to be familiar with particular studies or particular researchers, but you didn't necessarily have to have read all of Freud or have to have read Thorndike. You just had to be somewhat familiar. Whereas in philosophy, there does seem to be this expectation on having studied these a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And in some ways, I think philosophy is right to have that attitude. It is important to know the history of the questions that you're asking, because that often shapes what counts as an acceptable answer. And I think psychologists could do with knowing a bit more of their own history. But that's
fair. That's a fair.
But it is more, it is also this sort of, well, what is it you expect? What is it you think is going to be that somebody's going to know when you meet them? Mm-hmm.
So yeah, how did it feel? So was this something going along? Not having read a word of Kant, this was, how did it feel then going out on the graduate school applications, applying out to these different fields?
Well, it meant that so by the time I was at that point, I decided what I really wanted to do was philosophy of math.
Oh, okay.
I really thought that was what I wanted to work on. Wrote a senior thesis in philosophy of mathematics, and so applied to graduate school to do that.
Now, did you go right from undergrad, or was there any time?
Well, yeah. So I applied straight from undergrad to go to graduate school. Being a student sure was fun. Why would I want to stop being a student?
Fair enough. Yeah.
I had enough summer jobs to know that I didn't really want to go out into the workforce just yet. And I looked around at all the other philosophy majors, and they were all getting jobs as consultants, and that didn't sound like very much fun to me. So I thought,
what kind of consultants were they?
Working to go to work for Deloitte or these sort of management consulting firms, basically smart person for hire.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I suppose maybe coming out of Princeton, that probably is a little bit more favorable position. I don't think that happens as much in other schools, or maybe it was historically that's what was going on.
I think part of it may have been the timing. You have to remember this is now, I hate to say it, but 20 years ago.
Oh, sure.
So, this is the middle of the 90s.
That's not too long ago, but yeah, I can understand.
But also, yes, I think absolutely part of it was Princeton.
Sure.
And I recognize that. But no, so I decided to go to graduate school. And so I applied to a bunch of places and got a lot of really thin envelopes back. These were the days of envelopes, not email. And when all was said and done, basically didn't have a whole lot of choice about where I ended up next.
Sure.
Ended up at UC San Diego.
Oh, really? Okay.
Which at the time, when I went there were 7, 8 philosophers of science. It was this amazingly bustling place. It was just filled with life and energy, but it wasn't yet didn't yet have the name, so it helped to get in. I think that I didn't that it wasn't yet the place everybody wanted to go, and got there, and it was a very humbling experience because I was reminded again of how little I knew. I thought I knew a lot, and then got there and realized I really have no idea what I'm doing.
And was this in relation to philosophy of math or just philosophy in general?
It was philosophy in general. But it was also there's a kind of single-minded focus that happens in graduate school that didn't happen as much in undergrad. I mean, obviously at a place like Princeton, I was surrounded by smart people. But everybody had very diverse interests. So I was, I can only recall one other person that I was even sort of friendly with who was, in the sense of being more than just sort of knowing who they were and casual friends, who was a philosophy major. I didn't tend to hang out with other philosophers very much.
Sure.
And so suddenly being immersed in an environment where that's what people talked about. That's what people thought about, that people had a depth of understanding and knowledge that I just didn't have. And it wasn't that I couldn't acquire it. I mean, I could get it. It just was going to take time. And I didn't want it to take time. I was
you wanted it now.
Suddenly I didn't know what I was doing. And I knew what I was doing in philosophy of math, but there weren't very many people there wanting to do philosophy of math. There was a lot of philosophy of science, but philosophy of math was not a big thing at the time. And so although I knew in some sense at the time that I wanted to do philosophy of math, there weren't a lot of people around to talk to about that. And so I thought, well, okay, I'm taking classes in philosophy of science. I guess I ought to broaden out a little bit and start to figure out what else is going on in philosophy. And there I was running into people who'd been doing it for much longer than I had and at a much higher level. And so it was good to be reminded of just how hard one has to work.
Now, were these other students that you felt, in comparison, they had a lot more experience than you in this particular field, or was the professors themselves?
Both.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I look back at the people who were the senior graduate students when I arrived, and many of them are now very eminent philosophers. It was an incredibly vibrant time at San Diego. And so we had people like...
Who was in your consortium? Who was in your group?
Right. So, some of the more senior people were people like Kyle Stanford and Brian Keeley, some historians like Anne Margaret Baxley. I'm trying to think. So in my particular year, there was somebody who's now a neuroscientist, Eric Thompson. P.D. Magnus at Albany was in my year. And, so it was this sort of, the idea that these people would go on to be very prominent members of the field was to be, I don't know, it didn't quite cross my mind because it felt like my age. They are my age, right? You're your cohort, and people haven't had the chance to establish the track record yet. So you don't quite know whether this is somebody who's going to go on to really be a top-notch scholar.
Sure.
So it was great to start to broaden my horizons and actually had the impact of making me realize that there were lots of questions outside of philosophy of math that were far more interesting than the questions inside of philosophy of math. Coupled with a realization that my views in philosophy of math were very cognitivist, math as a social cognitive phenomenon, which at the time was a very out of favor view, shall we say, that made me think, all right, maybe I don't want to do this philosophy of math thing. And so maybe I want to do something different, something in philosophy of science, maybe something cognitive. I'd mostly try to stay away from cognition, I think, because I didn't want to do what my dad did. But
differentiate yourself. Your own scholar.
I finally started to realize, you know what? I find people really fascinating, and I'd like to learn more about cognition. And at the same time, there was a massive exodus of philosophers of science from the faculty at UC San Diego. It was incredibly exciting and vibrant, and suddenly people were leaving and going other places.
And how did that come about?
Entirely random chance. It was just a weird coincidence. So Philip and Pat Kitcher were there when I arrived. 2 years later, they were at Columbia. Sandra Mitchell was there 2 or 3 years after I arrived. She was at University of Pittsburgh. Nancy Cartwright was potentially going to be coming full time, but for various reasons decided to only come 1 quarter a year. Clark Gleamore was supposed to be coming, and for personal reasons decided to only come 1 quarter a year. So it was this sort of suddenly there were not nearly as many people as I thought were going to be there. And so the students were all there. It was still a very great student community, but there were not nearly as many faculty, which in retrospect actually worked out really well for me because it meant that there weren't very many people paying attention to what I was doing. Not that I recommend that to graduate students. I think it's important to have, faculty who know what you're doing and are looking out for you and helping, you make choices. But mine was more of a, hey, I want to go take a class on neural nets. I want to go take a class on rationality in the psych department. Hey, I want to go spend time working in a psych lab to learn how to run experiments.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And nobody told me no. I don't know if it's because, San Diego is an interdisciplinary place, but I think it was also that I just kind of did it because it seemed cool. You're noticing perhaps a trend here in my intellectual history, right? I do things because I go, that looks like fun.
And let's you go do it.
And, it's not planned. I didn't plan to end up doing a lot of the things I do. It's just, that seemed interesting. And now I've got this new tool in my tool belt. And hey, that looks like a fun problem. And I've got tools that might be able to help me answer that question. So let's go try and do it.
Yeah. Do you remember the psych lab you worked in or the psych labs? I don't know if you...
I did. So I worked, I decided as part of my dissertation that I really wanted to ask some questions that were going to require empirical data. And I looked around at the empirical literature. This is in cognitive psychology, working on how people learn causal relations in the world from data. And I thought it was important because I thought it was important to figure out what we can and can't learn, sort of what are the limits, a kind of epistemological question.
Sure.
And I looked at the psych literature, and nobody was asking, I thought, the right question. They were asking a particular kind of question, but it wasn't the one that I wanted to answer.
So what were they asking, and what were you wanting to?
So at the time, a lot of the work in causal learning was very focused on what I would call a kind of function estimation problem. So given these data, what number do people output as their belief of the causal strength?
Okay.
So it's a very number-focused kind of investigation. If we vary the frequency distribution of the cases you see, how does that change the number that you'll give us at the end? And I was very interested in the questions about how people learn causal structure. So not how they learn, say, just precisely how good aspirin is at relieving a headache. I wanted to learn, how do they know aspirin relieves headache in the first place?
Sure, yeah.
Leave aside the number part. Just how do they learn that qualitative relation? And in machine learning at the time, there'd been, over the preceding decade or so, the development of a whole set of new methods for doing this kind of causal learning, to learn what we now call causal graphs. Developed in part by Clark Gleamore, who I'd gotten to know when he was visiting his 1 quarter a year at San Diego.
Okay.
And so there's this formal framework sitting there, and the psychologists weren't using it. They weren't even asking questions in that framework. And so it seemed to me like, well, shouldn't we at least try? And the problem was, I couldn't get any psychologists to think this was interesting. So me being me, I said, well, okay, I'll just do it.
Yeah.
I mean, how hard could it be to run an experiment? Shows how naive I was, right? But I thought, how hard could it be?
It's amazing what lab, how I think typically supportive lab PIs are when you say you want to run. I mean, you do the work. They'll just be there. I don't know. Was that the case? Were they open to this?
It was absolutely the case. Craig McKenzie was just fantastic. He said, "You want to do this? Great. I'm happy to try and teach you." And so I would come up with ideas and I'd bring them to him and he'd say, "Okay, here's all the reasons that experiment won't work. And here's ways to try and modify." And I'd go, "Great." And I'd go off and I'd redesign and I'd come back and he'd say, "Okay, here's why it's not going to work." And it was exactly the kind of apprenticeship that I think is crucial when learning how to actually do any intellectual activity, whether it be philosophy or a science. I mean, I think there's
it's
no
so key.
substitute for somebody just walking you through and explaining not just that something is not going to work, but why it won't work. Because it often depends on the kind of unwritten knowledge that everyone in the field knows, but you're not going to find in a journal paper. And meanwhile, at about this time, I was lucky enough that Clark, who ultimately became my advisor, was starting to collaborate some with a developmental psychologist, Alison Gopnik, up at Berkeley. And so I had the opportunity to a couple of times go up to Berkeley with Clark for sort of these extended lab meetings, which were Clark and myself, Allison and some of her graduate students, and then somebody who was at the time at Stanford, Josh Tenenbaum, a psychologist, who would come over with a couple of people from his lab. And so that was also sort of these really formative experiences of, sitting in these groups of 9 or 10 of us, and just really coming to see how cognitive research gets done. And in retrospect, now realizing it was, an absolutely unbelievable group of people that we had there. Everybody who was in the room there is now tenured at a top 20 university.
Wow.
So
that is the definition of a think tank.
It was just sort of, and most of us were graduate students at the time. Josh, Clark, and Allison were the only ones who were faculty. So most of us were graduate students, but it was, and we all still to this day will see each other at the CogSci conference or something, and we'll reminisce about how that was a really formative experience to be in that kind of a room with that level of thought. And so just learning in that way by doing how to be a cognitive scientist.
I think that's fascinating. So were these discussions that took place, were they primarily around empirical research, or were there other methodologies with which you would discuss, or literature with which you would go over?
It was mostly empirical research, but very theoretically informed empirical research. Okay. So Josh Tenenbaum is one of the very leading people who've really led the movement.
Oh, where is he?
He's now at MIT, and really he's one of the flag bearers for Bayesian models in cognitive science.
Okay, yeah. I think he might be part of the HASS program. I'm not sure.
And he's just, this was just starting. I mean, nowadays you look at any cognitive paper and half of them have Bayesian models. But at the time, it was this sort of new innovation. This is the late 90s. And so Josh, from the Bayesian point of view, Clark bringing the causal modeling, causal graph point of view, Allison wanting to really think about, can we show that children are doing these quite sophisticated things? Because at the time there was, the joke was that if you read a cognitive psychology textbook, the message would be that, boy, children are really not very smart, but rats, they're brilliant. And because all the experiments with rats were trying to show all the amazing things they could learn, and with children, most of the experiments were showing what the kids didn't know how to do.
Sure.
And Allison's view is, no, kids are actually really, really smart. We're just asking a lot of the wrong questions in many cases, or we're asking in the wrong ways.
Sure.
So we're asking, can they do numeric estimation? No, but could they learn these qualitative relationships? Yes. And so the questions were about everything from how do you even test whether a 3-year-old understands the causal relations around them? You can't really quite ask them because they may not use the language we're used to. So how can you check for these things? how could you ever distinguish that from, them having a complex causal representation from a simpler causal representation, using the kinds of limited behavioral data you get from children? So it was a very sort of, yes, it was all driven by the empirical data, but it was very theoretical, very methodological in focus.
Yeah, it definitely seems philosophically or at least methodologically critical, methodologically motivated, and yeah, that sounds like a great conversation.
It was. I mean, in retrospect, I wish we could have, recorded them. But I'm probably happy that my musings were not recorded for posterity.
Oh, sure, sure.
But so it was this, it was this sort of funny experience where I'm at a program with lots of other graduate students interested in philosophy of science, but not so many faculty. I've got an advisor that for 10 weeks a year, I get to see him in person 2 or 3 days a week. Otherwise, everything's by email and phone.
Sure.
I'm hanging out with psychologists because I want to do the research, and they're telling me, here's how you do it. We'd love to have a philosopher hanging around. But meanwhile, I'm taking those courses on Kant and Plato that I never took as an undergrad, and being a TA for things like, Greek philosophy. And so it was it was a very intellectually exciting time. It was also the time when I met my now wife. She was also a philosophy graduate student at UCSD. She was a few years ahead of me. And so, just this immersion in thinking about these puzzles and these ways of trying to solve things. It was really a very exciting time, not because there was some leader, but in this sort of very just organic sense of everybody around was asking interesting questions and wanting to try and think and talk about these things.
And it seems like UCSD was a very supportive climate in having this done. Somewhat. I've
often wondered. I mean, some people were very supportive of it. Others, I think, didn't know what was going on in some sense.
Okay. Okay.
But it's hard for me to know. I don't know in some sense what other faculty who weren't on my committee, for example, thought of my dissertation. And in part also because one of the tricky parts of meeting a spouse in graduate school is you quite often then both want to get jobs as academics.
Yeah, how did that work out?
Well, so my wife, Mara Harrell, successfully got a job before I'd finished. She got a tenure-track job at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. And I knew I had at least a year to go, but we didn't get married so we could be apart. So I figured I would move to Colorado with her and finish my dissertation there.
Sure.
UCSD said, well, we give everybody a 1-year fellowship to finish their dissertation. So you get a year of funding. And then if you want any more, you have to come back. So I decided that means I've got 1 year to finish my dissertation. It's amazing how quickly you get motivated to finish a dissertation when you know the money's going to disappear. And so I moved to Colorado. We rented a house out in the middle of the woods that was 30 minutes from anything. And my wife, Mara, was a first-year professor at a very teaching-intensive school. So it was a lot of days of me and my computer just sitting and writing, which made a big difference in getting things done, but managed to finish. But then, of course, faced the problem of how do we, what do we do now? Colorado Springs is not, there's not a whole lot of universities there. There are a few, but there's not that many. And so I was looking around and at about this time was lucky enough to get a job offer from a research institute in Pensacola, Florida.
Oh.
It's called the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. It's a mostly grant-funded research institute. So I was going to be working on people's grants, and some portion of my time would be free to do whatever I wanted. But I'd get to be a research scientist and continue to think about problems. But now, instead of being at the intersection of psychology and philosophy, they'd be at the intersection mostly of psychology and artificial intelligence.
Okay.
And I thought, well, I've always loved computers. I don't know, I know some about AI and machine learning, but there's a chance to fill in some gaps. And these are fun, cool problems. And oh, by the way, I only have to spend 7 to 10 days a month down in Pensacola. Otherwise, I can be back in Colorado Springs.
Oh,
okay.
It's a great situation.
It's a way to solve the two-body problem, at least for a little while.
Sure.
And that was, again, a really interesting time because I was, in some ways, it was like doing a postdoc. About half my time, I was in the position of having to work on other people's projects, which forced me to expand my skill set in a lot of ways. I got a lot better at data analysis. I got a lot better at machine learning during that time and picked up a lot of new skills. And about half the time I could work on the things I wanted to work on, which was important in terms of sort of figuring out what it even was that I wanted to work on.
Yeah, so you're working on AI. I mean, are you finding yourself, you've gone from math to intersection of psychology and philosophy, more AI. I mean, is there something coalescing where you feel like this is what I want to do, or there's still a lot of different avenues you're interested in?
Well, what was coalescing was finding myself really interested more and more in cognition.
Okay.
Human cognition, machine cognition, didn't matter so much. It was, how can I sit in between these fields? I think that was the other thing. It's a kind of meta realization. It wasn't about content. It was about realizing how much I enjoyed sitting between different fields, that I loved trying to take insights from one field and put them to work in another one.
Yeah, what is it about that makes that so exciting?
I think what makes it exciting is that there's this sort of constant feeling that you're bringing something new to a question, a new perspective, a new way of thinking about a problem. At least for me, that's incredibly invigorating. I don't like working on problems that are incredibly clear and well specified. I like the problems where we're not quite sure how to think about them. The problem, which I suppose perhaps partially explains why I was drawn to philosophy in the very first place so many years ago.
Sure.
But the problems where we're still fumbling around, which is exactly when different perspectives become critical. It's exactly when we need to be able to take the insight of machine learning about how to think about particular kinds of data and bring it to bear on human cognition about questions in human cognition about how we parse the complex world that we face. So in that sense, I think that's what I enjoy, is trying to bring these different perspectives to bear rather than sort of staying within a well-defined lane.
Absolutely. And so as a researcher on staff there, were you one of the only philosophers working alongside some of the other empirical or roboticists there?
I was. A lot of the people there, I don't think, knew that I had a PhD in philosophy. I think they just assumed I had a PhD in psychology or computer science because I would just dive in with both feet to any problem that was put in front of me and didn't try and turn them into philosophical problems necessarily. I think that's something that interdisciplinary work, I think that's one of the things that marks out interdisciplinary work from disciplinary work or from multidisciplinary work is taking the problem as it actually stands rather than trying to squeeze it into a particular disciplinary frame.
I think that's an important distinction.
I was always very happy that if somebody came and said, well, we want to have something that can help people do a better job of capturing their knowledge in a knowledge representation tool. I didn't try and turn that into a philosophical problem about what exactly is the nature of knowledge. I said, okay, this is a cognitive science problem that I'm going to approach in a kind of very foundational, philosophically informed way. So I don't think I thought about problems the way that a lot of people down there did, but I don't think they recognized me as a philosopher either. It wasn't like my job was to be the staff philosopher or something like that.
Sure, your reasoning might have been different, or the way in which you thought about things, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the product or what you were bringing to the table was something you guys could all discuss and agree upon.
Absolutely. And so, not being down there full time was tricky. It meant that I was now spending, after having had these really great experiences in San Diego, I then had a year of pretty solitary work in a lot of ways, and now was doing a lot of work from home. It made me realize that thinking really hard is exhausting. I mean, it sounds easy to say that, but I found that I could only think hard for 4 to 6 hours a day at most. And so I felt a little guilty about that for a time because I thought I should be working harder, but I'm thinking, well, my brain is just fried. What am I supposed to do?
Sure.
And because I wasn't there physically present, I wasn't in endless meetings. I wasn't having to go to things just to listen to them. Mm-hmm. So it was a chance to really think about things that I wanted to think about and to try out new ideas and to see connections that I might not have seen before. It was a chance for, really deep thought on a lot of different issues, which was when it was important at that time. I think it's really what I needed.
Yeah. And how long were you there down in Florida?
Well, so I spent, so I was there for a year, and we applied to jobs trying to solve the two-body problem and had no luck. And so then I went into a second year there, and we applied for jobs looking to solve the two-body problem, and had made the decision that it was the last time I was going to go on the job market. To start a family. I was tired of traveling that much. It was physically hard and emotionally hard. It's just hard to be on the road that much. Being one of those, the airline frequent flyers seems really cool until you realize how much you pay for it in physical and emotional exhaustion to travel that much.
I was always wondering what it would be like to be one of those folks who travels 40 weeks out of the year, or
Yeah, it's a lot less fun than I thought it was going to be.
Sure. It carries this sense of importance, but at what cost?
Exactly. And at that point, I would have had 2 full years under my belt of doing computer science, AI, machine learning, cognitive science, user interface. So I would have been employable in the tech industry, which we're now talking 2002, 2003. It's really exploding. Everybody, this is these like pets.com. I'm not saying it was a good explosion, but there was lots of jobs. There were lots of jobs everywhere, including a lot in Colorado. And we wanted to start a family. So we said, you know what, this will be it. If we don't find something, my wife's got this wonderful tenure track job. She loved Colorado College. We'll just do that, and I'll leave academia. And we got rejection, and then we both got interviews here at Carnegie Mellon.
Yeah, and I see you started in 2003.
Exactly. And so we both came. Carnegie Mellon had 2 different jobs they were looking for, which we were independently qualified, each of us, for one of them. Yeah.
Now, is your spouse in philosophy of science, or is she a different kind of philosophy?
So my wife, Mara, is her training was in philosophy of physics. She's got a master's in physics, wrote a dissertation on chaos theory.
Wow.
But her real love is pedagogy and teaching.
Oh, great.
So for her, Colorado College was an amazing place because it was a teaching-focused institution in a lot of ways, small liberal arts college. And Carnegie Mellon was looking for somebody, the philosophy department was looking for somebody to really sort of run their undergraduate program, to actually pay attention to it, because unfortunately at a lot of research institutions, the undergraduate program sometimes gets neglected.
Yeah.
And so the faculty here at the time said, we really want to do something about that. We want somebody who will have that be their main focus. And they also wanted to expand into philosophy and psychology. So we applied for those 2 jobs, thinking, well, who knows? We've got to try. We knew some of the people here. I knew some of them from previous intellectual reasons. And in fact, my former advisor, Clark Gleamore, was on the faculty here. And so we applied. Everyone knew that we were a couple. And so there, no point in offering a job to just one of us.
Yep.
And lo and behold, we both got offered the jobs.
Oh, that's great.
So it is a case. I was one rejection letter from leaving academia, but it came through. And then we looked around, and Colorado College did not offer me a position. And so in that sense, it was a very easy decision for us.
So that was, it was either, there was a hope that you might stay in Colorado, but it sounds like having a job in Carnegie Mellon seemed like the best bet.
Well, having jobs in the same department is what was the most important thing.
Yeah.
And so we both came here in 2003, and we've stayed here ever since. We've had some chances to leave, but this has been an absolutely amazing place to be. the thing that I think really sold me on wanting to come here without any question was when I was here for my job interview and was at dinner after giving the job talk. And I remember my now colleague, Steve Awady, sitting across from me, looks at me and goes, "Now, you understand, you're going to have to publish in psychology journals if you want to get tenure here."
Really? And
I just thought, Steve has no memory of this. I've told him this story because it was so significant to me. He goes, "Really? I said that? Huh, I had no idea." But it's true. It's the kind of place that it was a good thing that I was publishing outside of philosophy. It was viewed as almost necessary to my success that I be engaged with psychologists and with machine learning people and philosophers of science, of course, as well. But it's a place that from the very beginning, it was made very clear to me that it was my job as a researcher to chase interesting problems. It was not my job to stay in my disciplinary lane. I was supposed to go after interesting, cool problems and then use whatever methods were necessary to answer those problems.
Oh my gosh. It sounds amazing.
It is. I really can't imagine a place that would have been better at that time or for me now. In terms of really being able to just give me the freedom to ask the questions that I want to ask. And in that sense, especially after hearing how I got here, the repeated comments I've made of, well, I just studied that because it seemed cool, to come to a place where, well, I just researched it because it seemed interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't have to give a second thought to, oh, but what are my colleagues going to think? Oh, but maybe they won't let me do that. Maybe it won't count towards my tenure. Maybe
it's not appropriate for this journal. Maybe it's not philosophical enough. Things like that.
Exactly. Instead, I just work on puzzles. And then once I think I've got something to say, I say, okay, well, what journal would be the right one? And if it's a psychology journal, great. If it's a philosophy journal, great. If it's a computer science, machine learning conference, great. And you don't have to tailor the problem to the journal. You turn the journal to the problem.
So do you recall going up for tenure, the proportion of empirical work publications to philosophical, like philosophy journals kind of publications?
I would say at the time it was probably maybe 50-50, if not a bit more empirical. Now it's probably about 50-50 when I came up for tenure. But even the philosophical work was heavily informed by the empirical. The empirical work was guided by the machine learning and computer science and AI. The AI was guided by the philosophy. I mean, it really was this feeling of, I'm just working on problems and I'm not going to worry. And I'm going to worry that they're foundational problems. They needed to be, foundational or methodological questions.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they're very philosophical. I mean, they're questions like, what's the nature of scientific knowledge when you have distributed measurements? Different labs measure different things. So how do we get to grand scientific theories? What are the limits on what we as humans could do? I mean, that's a sort of very straightforward philosophy of science or epistemological question. I just happen to use some machine learning tools to try and help answer it. And so in that sense, it was, I think it was probably 50-50, That's right? Which worked out just fine. Carnegie Mellon, that's what they wanted to see.
And so now, coming up to the present, what occupies your time mostly now? How do you find yourself in split between these different approaches?
Well, interestingly, I feel like I've been doing a lot more philosophy over the last.
Oh, okay.
In funny ways. Part of that is I find I don't have as much time to do empirical work as I used to. Part of it is that I've gotten really interested in puzzles that look more philosophical. I've been doing some work in applied ethics, for example, looking at ethical issues around autonomous systems, so self-driving cars, weapons systems, killer robots, but also cyber defense systems, which are, it turns out, very autonomous. And so trying to look at sort of what is it for actual humans, creatures with our cognitive makeup, our limits, our foibles, what is it for us to act ethically? What are the ethical principles when interacting with these kinds of systems? Because a lot of the work that's out there is either tech-focused, it's really focused on, here's what a self-driving car can do, as opposed to how to be ethical about it. Or it seems to presuppose a kind of completely rationalist picture of humans who, on this model, know everything, can predict what they'll want in the future, are hyper-rational, all the things that we know humans aren't. And so, what is it really to be an ethical human engaging with these kinds of systems has been something that's really interested me, and that's a more traditional ethical question. Of course, at the same time, I'm doing work. You asked earlier about what my day is like. Well, earlier today, I had a meeting with a couple of people doing biomedical research to see if we can figure out some of the features of essentially how people respond to anesthetic during surgery, and whether we might be able to use that information to better predict who's going to have health complications in the following 30 to 60 days.
Wow! So how did this kind of project get off the ground? I mean, it just not because I'm particularly just generally super interested in it, but just it just seems so distinct from your other lines of work. Well, it is, except it has to do with sort of machine learning and AI. Oh yeah.
So where it came about is the NIH has funded a fairly large center that's joint between the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, called the Center for Causal Discovery. And the point of it is to try and use the big biomedical data that are being generated now and try to use that to learn about underlying causal mechanisms and causal systems in humans. Well, we have a group of us here actually in the philosophy department. I'd mentioned earlier this work on causal modeling, causal graphs, part of it done by Clark Leamore, who was my advisor, now my colleague here, but also by my colleagues Peter Sperdes, Richard Shyness. We've now hired somebody, Kun Zhang, who does this work as well. All of us with this sort of interest in how is it that we or any agent can go from data to an understanding of causation. So you can think of this as how do we solve Hume's problem? Hume says we don't see causation, we just see data. And we say, yeah, but how could an intelligent agent solve this problem? We're all in a philosophy department. So oddly, this Center for Causal Discovery, funded by the NIH to do big data, has a group of philosophers in it, not to do bioethics, but to do algorithms, to come up with new ways of extracting causal information from data. Wow. And so as a part of that connection, I've gotten connected up with these people who, one's an anesthesiologist and one does biomedical informatics, and they've got these data, and we want to see what we can figure out from it. You got people, different methodologies, interested in a puzzle. Exactly. And it struck me as a pretty cool, pretty important puzzle. I mean, it's not often that a philosopher gets to do something where you truly can say, if we can solve this puzzle or make progress on this puzzle, we could try and save people's lives. Oh. So it seemed to me this is something worth doing. And so let's sit down and just do it. And I think that's, I will say that's one of the true joys I've come to realize of having tenure. Yeah. Is I can just say, you know what, that sounds interesting. I just want to do it. And it's sort of the ultimate security to do what I've always wanted to do, what I've always basically done all along anyway, which is say, let's just do it. But now I don't have to feel guilty or worry that I'm sabotaging myself in the long run. It's like, nope, I'm okay now. So I really can just follow my instincts. Say, that looks like fun. Let's go do it. That sounds great. So yeah, I got to ask. So for those of us who are still aspiring philosophers of science or empirically informed philosophers or vice versa, do you have any advice for us that, are coming up, forming our own research programs, interested in and working on puzzles like yourself? What would you say? Well, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is, and this is somewhat trite advice, but I think it's still good to hear it, which is do things that you enjoy. If you don't enjoy it, you're not going to want to be doing it at 10 p.m. on a Thursday night. And I can tell you right now at 10 p.m. tonight, I've got a paper on neuroimaging that I'm doing with somebody who just graduated from Pitt and is now at a postdoc at WashU. And we're trying to get a paper done. And I'm really excited to work on it tonight. And so after my daughter goes to bed, I'm going to be working on a paper. Not because I have to. You know, as I said, I've gotten tenure. Like, I don't need
you don't have to work on this paper. Yeah.
But it's fun and I love doing it. And I don't think, you know, this is a kind of career that it asks a lot of you. And your colleagues will ask a lot of you. And I think you'd better really love it, or at least find it really fascinating to do. Which means if you're doing something you think, well, this is a puzzle that other people have said, and I'm writing on so-and-so's solution to this problem. I don't enjoy it. There's going to be some of that in any, academic career. But I think it's important to stop and say, well, wait a second, what is it I really would enjoy? And try and find a way to pursue that.
Well, it's interesting because unfortunately you hear around the halls these kind of, oh, this is a really hot topic right now. This is something I should be working on, is what goes through your head, or what, and for those, it's if you find the puzzles that other people like, but in contrast with if you don't really enjoy doing that, how much leeway can you give oneself from enjoyment to this is something with which it would be beneficial for you career-wise to focus on.
That's right. I do think that one of the very practical tips that I would give people is if you do try to follow some of that advice or some of what I've managed to successfully do, which is just following what you think is a cool puzzle and trying to solve it. There's a burden that falls on you when you do that. And the burden is, it's up to you to convince other people it's cool.
Okay.
So that's one of the things that I really had to struggle with very early on in my career, was learning how to get other people excited about the puzzles that I found interesting.
And how, so from your experience, how did you go about doing that?
Well, the first thing was to recognize that not everyone gets excited about the stuff I get excited about. And so I'd better find a way to talk to them in their terms. And so it takes a lot of different forms. Sometimes what it is it's a matter of reframing the puzzle in the language of some contemporary debate that's already out there. Sometimes it's a matter of learning to tell better stories. Sometimes it's a matter of spending months reading things, trying to find just the right example that makes it a really vivid puzzle. Sometimes it's sending a paper to 7 journals, sending it, getting a rejection, sending it, getting rejection, sending it, and you just keep trying. Or you go and you give talks and you try out a framing and you try out, hey, here's a way of doing it. And people go, yeah, I don't get it. And you go, okay, back to the drawing board. The key is not to one of the advantages when you work on a hot topic is you don't have to convince people it's interesting. You can just report the results or report the argument. I don't have that luxury most of the time. But that's okay. That's a price I'll gladly pay, though it's easy for me to say that.
Well, if you get to do what you love, it seems that certainly outweighs the work with which you would have to put in for a little salesmanship.
I think that's right. And connected to that, the other big piece of advice I would give, because I see this a lot, and this is especially for people who are in philosophy graduate school or early philosophers of science. And that's that I think it's important to not be afraid to actually make a positive contribution to the science. I see a lot of philosophy of science that I think either stands outside the science and sort of reports on it and talks about it, or that has a kind of, here's this problem with the science, here's this conceptual confusion. And I think when you do that, those are important, very legitimate tasks. I don't want to say that those are not things nobody should be doing that. Those are absolutely good things for people to be doing. But I also think that a lot of times it's okay as a philosopher to take the next step and say, okay, here's this problem. I'm going to try to solve it. And I think sometimes philosophers get this sort of, I view it as a kind of insecurity, which is, but I'm not a scientist. And to which I say, these aren't bright lines.
Yeah.
Go ahead and try and solve it, or try and find a scientist that you can convince it's an interesting problem and solve it with them. And when you do that, I think you gain so much more in terms of an appreciation for the science that you are studying and analyzing and talking about. When you're actually able to engage with it and do it in a way that that is what the practitioners of the science, this is what the scientists themselves will recognize and respect. And it opens doors, because now all of a sudden people go, wait a second, you get what we do over here in the science. So come to our lab. Let me tell you about this new idea I've got. And suddenly you can do so much more in philosophy of science itself, because you've got you've got access, and you know the science, and you've got a kind of understanding of what it really means to do the science. I mean, I confess I often can find, when I pick up a philosophy of science paper, say to pick my own discipline, something in philosophy of psychology or philosophy of neuroscience, you can tell the people who've done the science and who hasn't.
Yeah.
There's just a difference in their understanding of all the things that go beyond what you can read in a journal paper. And so I think, philosophers shouldn't feel like our job ends, that there's this bright line that you can't go across because, that would be to do the science. I think, go do it some, or find people who want to help you do it. And don't be afraid to go native, as it were, to use the phrase of anthropologists. I think there's a lot to be gained from them.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, David, and this lasting advice, I think, will go a long way, I think, for those of us philosophers of science, scientists themselves, just amateur aspiring puzzle solvers. This is really good. This is really good advice. So I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to share, or anything you'd like to plug? Some of your own work, students' work, anything of the sort?
Well, I wish I had more of my own work to plug, but one of the downsides of being a department head is that you spend a lot of time helping make other people's work possible. So I'm still struggling, but no, I think there's always new ideas coming down the pipeline, and so I guess I would just plug, hey, go check out my webpage.
Yeah, so your webpage, you have David Danks. You have I was going to say if there's a catchy web title, but I imagine you search you're
I was going to say just search me. There's actually only one other person that comes up regularly when you Googled David Danks. And it's somebody that I don't know that there's any relation to, but he passed away. He is actually often called the father of Australian genetics. He was an incredibly prominent geneticist in Australia who passed away about a decade ago, which made Google Scholar interesting when it suddenly thought that I had all these papers on copper metabolism in babies. And I thought, no, that's not me.
Well, great, David. Well, yeah, again, it was a real pleasure chatting with you. And it sounds like what's going on at Carnegie Mellon is very exciting. If I ever happen to go down there for one of the graduate student conferences or whatnot, I'll be sure to drop you a line.
Please do. We're always looking for fun and bright people who are interested in solving puzzles.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, David. Have a good rest of the day. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.